Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. And we're going to segue from birds to changing trends in collective bargaining. I'm Rebekah Smith. I'm a mediator arbitrator working primarily throughout New England, based in Maine, and I'm going to moderate the panel today. I don't think panelists, we talked about whether you want me to introduce you, which I'm happy to do, or if you want to do your own brief introduction. Liam, any preference?
I think we just briefly introduce ourselves. So I'm Liam Gallagher. I'm the Director of Human Resources, the Assistant Town Manager for the town of Scarborough.
Great. And Paul?
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Paul Gaspar, I'm the Executive Director for the Maine Association of Police.
Great. Carl?
Hello, Carl Anderson, 3rd District Vice President for the Professional Firefighters of Maine and Lieutenant for Rockland Fire Department.
Great. Thank you. And Angela?
Hi, I'm Angela McQuinney. I'm the Director of Field and Organizing for MSCA SEIU Local 1989.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks, panelists, for being here. We met a couple times and had some conversation about how we want to structure our time. And I'm just coming back from vacation, so I'm a little scattered. I apologize. Do we have an hour and a half?
Hour and a half.
Is that what we were remembering? Okay. So, okay. Okay, great. Well, I think we have a lot to cover, so that is great. And the way we've organized the discussion is to start with what we're seeing as micro trends, and primarily that'll be our panelists who are in the municipal public safety sectors to talk about a variety of trends, including mental and physical health, negotiating, labor management committees, rehire provisions, family medical leave, and workplace training and development. And then we're going to switch gears a little bit and acknowledge the seismic changes that have occurred in the last several months and what they mean for negotiating collective bargaining agreements. And Angela's going to lead that part of our discussion. And we have some topics identified that she's been seeing come to the forefront. So we can take these in any particular order, Liam, Carl, and Paul, but I know you were going to lead the discussion on the micro trends.
Yeah, maybe it'd be helpful just to start with, from my perspective, and again, I think a lot of what I'll share today is what I've experienced and seen for the town of Scarborough, which is a data point, but I think it's largely reflective of a lot of trends. So our collective bargaining agreements, we're closing out the first year. So again, the world was a little bit different this time last year when we were finalizing those contracts. But I think the sort of labor market would be a good place to start, because I think that's what a lot of the items we'll talk about kind of stem from. So if Paul and Carl, you're agreeable to that, I'm happy to make some introductory remarks. So, I guess a lot of these things, again, will apply to the public safety sector in the public sector. And what we've seen is just a significant increase in the wages that these contracts and staff are commanding. The job market, I think, is really a continuation of some of the effects of COVID in terms of people really being more selective about what they want, how they want to spend their professional time. And so I think the applicant pools are shrinking, and where the demand is the effect on the demand, I think, has just seen really significant increases, especially on our police side, which I'm sure Paul will speak to. So going into the last year, I think there was just a really significant demand on wage increases, overall benefits. It's really just a labor market that was conducive to the employees as opposed to the employer. So that's some of what we experienced as a setting for the last round of negotiations. I think that's really what laid the groundwork for a lot of the things we'll talk about in terms of those other trends.
Okay, great. Anyone else, Paul or Carl, you want to add to that kind of lay of the land before we turn to some of the specific topics we identified?
Yeah, and I'm sure Carl will have similar examples, so I'll try not to bogart the conversation. But it has been, I think it's been an incredible 3 or 4 years for public safety, both police, fire, EMS, our nurses, through the COVID pandemic, where it was still very much a no-fail situation. And we had a lack of a lack of interest in police work specifically prior to COVID, and then coming out of it, it was an almost certainty where we saw drastic drops in applications and retention of officers, because I think that concentrated 2 or 3 years really burned a lot of people out. And as Liam denoted to, a lot of time away from family, concern about constant exposure as a no-fail position, whether it be police, fire, or medical, and bringing that home to your family. And coming out of that, I think the best way to explain it is we're calling it the unofficial age of the sidebar agreement. Because we've just had to consistently and uniquely adapt to the changing ways, a lot of those of which were completely out of either the employer's control or the union's control. And we're still seeing that, and the importance of sitting down in conversation to do these sidebars, but also the changing dynamic that we're sitting at the table because this affects both equally. And we have to come to a consensus on how we can move forward versus this is a labor issue versus an employer issue. So that's kind of one of the largest things we've seen, all the while still trying to figure out how to recruit and retain people. And I know we'll talk about a couple of those programs.
Okay, great. And Carl, anything you want to add to the lay of the land?
Yeah, on the fire side, I mean, it's a new world. I mean, it's completely new. I mean, it's a new generations, new thoughts, new ways of doing things. And unfortunately, or fortunately, the biggest problem that we've had with even getting a collective bargaining, agreement together, or hiring or anything, is trying to make those two ends meet. And it stinks. It's horrible. It is almost impossible sometimes. It is stubborn, this is the way we've always done things, and new age, hey, we want to do it this way. And on the other end of it, it's that on the, going the opposite way, because the younger generation doesn't want to hear what they have to say, and the older one doesn't either. So it is that the happy middle point in an actual CBA is very hard to meet in the middle. And Paul touched on it really good, when it comes to these midterm MOUs and different things that we're doing to, that were unheard of 10, 15 years ago. You didn't have midterm bargaining to increase wages, or, to make one set of people happy. Never happened. So it's one of my biggest things on today is going to be just being able to punt when you don't know what else to do.
Okay, great, thanks. So I'm just going to walk us through the topics as we sort of identify them as a group, but if you feel like you want to rearrange them, just let me know. So I had first on our list mental and physical health CBA provisions.
Sure, I'm happy to kick that off. So again, with the lay of the land being that compensation really was a big driver here in Scarborough, what we ended up doing was negotiating some new programs in our public safety contracts, so police, fire, and dispatch, that had a mandatory mental health component. So we provided an hourly stipend. I think it worked out to about $1,000 on the base wage per year, simply to see a mental health provider once a year. So it was probably the most expensive hour of their time that we had. And that also worked into their base wage for purposes of overtime, but it really put a fine point on, I think, some of the issues that Paul and Carl are very well aware of with their people, that, these first responders have really, really difficult jobs, and they see and they hear and they experience things that many of us will be fortunate never to have to experience, and they do it on almost a daily basis. And so recognizing that there is some additional support that's really required for our folks if they want to have a long and healthy career. And so I think, over the last 5, 6, 7 years, certainly up here in Maine, we've seen a really big change in the culture of our public safety staff to really try to embrace this notion of mental health. And so that was something that we sought to advance and put a lot of money behind. Obviously, in addition to the wages, there are obviously clinician expenses and some other peer support group expenses that we were happy to fund and support. The physical fitness piece, for me, this is as much related to the mental health as it is about just being generally physically able to do the job and again have a long and healthy career. I think the relationship to stress relief and exercise is important. So the programs that we negotiated in our contracts were voluntary programs, but again, very heavily incentivized, $1 or more per hour on the base wage if they participated in the physical fitness program, which was really modeled after the CDC requirements for adult physical fitness. So 150 minutes of anaerobic activity a week, and along with some muscle strengthening activities. In addition to that, they have to complete and show proof of an annual physical with their PCP and attend at least 2 Maine Municipal Employee Health Trust wellness courses, typically geared towards first responders and some of those other ancillary or auxiliary health concerns. So that's again, very expensive program from a budget standpoint. Well over $100,000 a year if everyone were to participate. But again, it's something that we feel really strongly that, our first responders should have access to and be incentivized to participate in. And we kind of, our theme going into the last round of contracts was really looking out for their mental health, their physical health, and their financial health. And a combination of those things really came together, I think, in a nice way that has been really, really well received and allowed us to be competitive with the higher paid departments in the state, but we are asking for some additional participation, involvement, and commitment over and above just the day job.
So that's really helpful, Liam, and interesting. So it sounds like all those programs and provisions you just talked about were employer driven in the negotiation. Is that right?
Those are our objectives. That's correct. Yeah.
And then have you had enough time to assess sort of the uptake in the voluntary provisions, like the physical health provisions?
Yeah, so it varies by group. We have lower than what we thought participation on the fire side. I think we're the first quarter just kind of came in one, and I think we were closer to 30% participation. Again, it's not an easy program. Finding 150 minutes or more a week and all the other pieces is a lift. And we think that the compensation to come along with that is commensurate. On the police side, I think we're closer to 2/3 participation. Dispatch is probably somewhere in between. So again, it's a starting point. I think it's the ability for people who, compensation and income is really a driving force, I think it is in everyone's life with what life just costs now. And so I think giving them the ability to earn additional compensation and kind of put the ball in their court is also an important component to it.
Okay, great. Paul or Carl, you want to talk about what you've seen in the arena of mental and physical health provisions?
Sure. I think Liam just gave a perfect example of the small microcosm that's taking place in other municipalities. And, for me, in our organization, we look at all first responders as equal. So when we talk, whether you're a police officer, firefighter, EMS, dispatch, as far as we're concerned, you are, for all intents and purposes, a first responder. And that point of view has come after a years-long reckoning of the huge impact that this job has on all first responders. I can tell you that, and we're still wrestling with it to this day, and which leads into constant conversations in labor management. But I think the overriding theme is that no two people in crisis are the same. So there is no textbook answer or direction to take. It's very much not necessarily on the fly, but it encourages the communication between providers, union officials, people in the employer sector, to understand that particular individual's needs, the amount of their trauma, and et cetera, et cetera. So we just finished a study as a stakeholder group, and unbeknownst to us, and this is specific to Maine on the police side, even though we feel as though we have a very incredibly safe state, we've had 26 police officers in the state of Maine commit suicide in the near distant future from probably about the 1980s until now, many of which even those of us in law enforcement were not aware of. And I can tell you it became such an important issue that we put out a survey as part of the stakeholder group. And we had, out of 2,800 licensed police officers, we had over 740 responses to the survey within 30 days, which, according to the people at Margaret Chase Smith Center, is nearly unheard of. So, and I think what you look at is, especially whether it's firefighters, police, EMS, dispatch, COVID only added to the issues affecting first responders. And regardless of the trauma that first responders see every day, COVID had a huge impact on that. And it really forced a lot of us to take a hard look at how we're going to deal with this, because we're still very much in an age, and I can't speak for the fire service, but at least in law enforcement, there is still very much of a stigma attached to mental health in law enforcement, with the overarching fear that to show any chink in the armor could spell the end of your career. And sadly to say, in our first forays into dealing with this, we had to do a lot of work to prevent that from happening. So, and then when you have the external sources such as post George Floyd, post COVID, and now just this vitriolic political atmosphere out of everybody's control, it's made our job kind of 10 times harder. And what we're desperate for the most is, just as we're short of first responders, we're short of providers. And more to the point, providers who are culturally competent. And what we mean by culturally competent is that they work, live, and understand within the parameters of first responders. For example, we have a first responder nurse psychiatric practitioner that we trust implicitly with our people. But that comes from also sending people to providers who were either afraid of law enforcement, and we were not getting the commensurate level of care that we would with somebody who's culturally competent. So it's been eye-opening for us, at least on the police side, to understand what all is involved, just on a singular level between each person in moving forward, and then trying to how to preserve their safety and security with their own position as well, as opposed to everything they bring home, because this also has a cascading effect on spouses, significant others, children, et cetera, et cetera. So it is a massive scale that is daunting.
And are you seeing any particular contracts, negotiations to implement some of the sort of safety measures or treatment or options for assessment? Or
it's challenging because there are so many other bureaucracies involved. Because when you talk about mental health, there's a likely possibility that this person may not be able to return to police work, fire service, EMS, what have you, and then what happens? So there are a lot of preliminary bureaucratic processes, whether it be Maine state retirement system or Maine public employees retirement system, disability, workers' comp. Basically, if you're an MMA or you're a single source provider for insurance. And the thing we have not been able to tackle, which would be most helpful in a contract context, would be we have not yet, as a bureaucracy, taken into account that a person who is experiencing trauma, they have to tell their story multiple times within these bureaucracies. which is in and of itself a re-injury of that person. And I can tell you, just with workers' comp, we've had a member go 2.5 years having to tell their story through appeal and denial and appeal. And finally, after 18 months, finally be awarded their disability under retirement, all the while still having the same experience parallel with workers' comp. So there is no one singular process. And we have yet to see it not have an impact on somebody going through it. And yet there are the things that we all know are realities.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately what I would do is apparently
All right, can we mute that?
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay.
So I think the big part of that would be finding a streamlined way to do everything at the same time, but knowing that we're dealing with huge bureaucracies that are clearly set aside in their own statutory ranges. And I think the last part of it would be, I don't know how you codify that in a contract other than to try to be as protective as possible, meaning let's not do anything until all those processes have played out. And that we know is a daunting ask of the employer, because it could mean that this goes on for 2.5 years, that this person is still employed by the employer.
Rebekah, can I just jump in for a sec?
Yeah, please.
So just on the mental health component, I think, and at the risk of, we could obviously spend a lot of time talking about the mental health component. I think from just our perspective, I think, because we did get that question a lot as we proposed this, and particularly as we were saying, this is going to be a mandatory requirement of your position here is to actually sit in front of a mental health provider once a year. And that sort of fitness for duty question came up. What if I go see this person and they say I shouldn't be doing this job anymore? And the way, we brought the provider in that we wanted to work with to meet directly with the staff, and they had the ability to ask any questions they wanted. But we did make that distinction that this is not a fitness for duty. We will never use this provider for fitness for duty. This is simply a mental health check-in. You can talk to them about whatever you want to, but that's not what this is for. And we also said, in the likelihood that you go in for your annual mental health checkup and something is disclosed or said in that 15-minute meeting that's so concerning to them that they say, I think you need to take some time away from work, whether that's temporarily or permanently, would be very, very low. However, if that were the case, I think we all recognize, without having to deal with any specific situation, then that's really what should happen, is that they should be removed from the job, and that's really in everyone's best interest. So I think there was a lot of, just again speaking to the collective bargaining, the contractual piece, I think there was a lot of initial apprehension for a lot of the reasons that Paul's talking about, because when it comes to PTSD claims and workers' comp and disability, that is a really, really challenging process all the way around. We were just simply advocating for that's not exactly what we're talking about. And in terms of the stigma, I agree. That's really real still in the sort of warrior mentality of a lot of our public safety agencies, that you don't let anything on. But that's why we made it mandatory, and we made it mandatory right out of the gate. We said this is what everyone is going to do, because what we know about mental health and trauma is that you are going to have to deal with this. And the only question is when and how. And so if we accept that as a premise, and again, all the experts who are far brighter than I am, that's what they say, it's just how you deal with this trauma and deal with this stress. Let's get some early intervention is the universal approach to everything. And one last word with regard to workers' comp. Again, Maine passed a PTSD presumption law, it's probably 7 or 8 years ago now. And unlike some other presumption laws and other legislation, that there's that universal understanding that early intervention with regard to mental health is the best remedy and approach. And so everyone was sort of aligned on that approach to this issue right along through.
Okay.
Yeah, the only thing I add, because Liam hit it on the head, it's like we can't be in a constant cycle of responding to crisis. We have to be able to get ahead of it. And I think part of the culture change is what we're experiencing now. And the workers' comp statute is the perfect example. That currently has a sunset provision. So there was not a full commitment by workers' comp to that. And that's currently running its way through the legislature as we speak, as to whether to just convert that to a permanent, and it would be a rebuttable presumption, which means it wouldn't be an automatic presumption, but at least it's something. But again, these are the ripples that have the overall effect on the public safety sector as they see, well, how committed are they if there's a sunset and they keep bringing it back up and things like that. So, but to Liam's point, I think there is a recognition that there has to be preventative measures versus response all the time, because response will be a tax on all of the systems because you're coming from a place of absolute necessity.
Okay. And Ronnie just added a comment. Thank you, Ronnie, about the PTSD presumption. So there's obviously a lot to talk about on this topic. And we have a few others that we were going to touch on before we shift to the moving forward part of it. But Carl, before I do that, did you want to add anything in particular on the mental or physical health provisions you're seeing being negotiated?
Sure. Well, so and to Liam's point, I would just like to say from what I've seen in CBAs or whatever's been presented to me, I am all about discussion when it comes to mandatory, but punitive is the other word. Mandatory is definitely, I'm all about dealing with management when it comes to mandatory items. What I am not into is punitive. And that, I think, he had spoke a little bit too. And I think that's going to be the biggest part of this is making these, while you are checking in to do stuff, is it punitive? Touching on the physical side of things, okay, is it mandatory to go to these physical health check-ins? Okay, well, what if they discover that you're, quote unquote, not healthy or unfit? Is that punitive? Are you going to lose your job? Because let's be honest, I mean, I know plumbers that probably shouldn't even be walking up a set of stairs. So it's a very sensitive side of which side of things that we're doing things to do good and to do harm. And what I've seen for the physical, and we'll stick with the physical side for now. One of my biggest things that I've been seeing lately, and I've been seeing shot down really fast, is the cancer presumption. When it comes to the physical side of this is, we have the presumptive cancer screening bill in place for firefighters, and the PCPs are not on board. PCPs won't do it. If you're a healthy 35-year-old guy and you go to your PCP and you want to go and do this, they say no. And they say you got to go pay out of pocket $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, who knows, to go get these tests because, quote unquote, you don't need them. So you have to go to your municipality to say, hey, listen, we want to try to do something about the cancer screening. And they say, well, we gave you health insurance, so that's it. And, because it's going to cost money and there is no insurance that's going to cover it. You have to literally find money for it. So that's a big ask on the physical side of things, because at the end of the day, the municipality could receive some sort of, discount on their insurance for the city because, everybody's healthy and they're participating. What do they get when they find out everybody's cancer free? Nothing. You don't get a thing. The firemen get a presumptive line, which is great, but so that is one thing that I've tried to get into CBAs. It's not working, but the conversations are happening, and that'll lead into labor management that we talk later on. But I mean, it's they're saying no because it's just money just to put out there. So, but that is a huge trend that I would love to see start getting better. And as far as the mental health side of it goes, I can tell you that I spoke with a member who was at the Behavioral Center for Excellence that the IAFF has in Maryland, and for all sorts of things. And they were commenting on how many firefighters and first responders were leaving the center because they ran out of time, because their municipality doesn't give you sick time to do that. They had to use their own comp time. They had to use their own vacation time. They had to use all these different things because that's just the way it was. And they were leaving before treatment was over. And just knowing that is disheartening to me. No, knowing that me as a person who is responsible for trying to get you the best CBA possible, that's a pretty bad case scenario to think about. If you need something that we're not really there to, we're not thinking of it. And it's because it's not being brought up in the light that it should be. Firemen are dying, from, first responders are dying from suicide a lot. And we are saying, yep, well, man, there's a generation that's saying, man, we got to get something done with this. And there's another generation saying, well, they must have something else going on. And what we can do for the CBA trends is to, like Liam was saying, try to get something in there that starts the wheel going down the road. But the other part of it is we got to start bringing it out into the norm of normalcy, and trying to get it into contracts to say, hey, listen, let's say this happens, you're going to be taken care of. We're forward thinking, the municipality's coming forward and saying, let's say that you have to go do this, you're going to get all this time off. And you know what? Nobody's going to tell you in the middle of negotiations that they have a behavioral health issue. But what they're going to do is secretly in the back of their mind, they're going to fight for time off because it's going to help what they're fighting.
Okay. So lots to talk about there. Obviously, we have about 12, 15 minutes to cover the rest of the topics. So maybe I'm just going to remind folks what we had for topics. And then if you have something you really want to pursue and share, let's jump to that. So we had negotiating labor management committees, rehire provisions, family medical leave, and workplace development and training.
I can just touch briefly on rehire. Just again, from our experience, our interest in incorporating this into our collective bargaining agreements was really because we had some kind of stubborn vacancies. We'd have an employee retire or resign, and we're able to sort of backfill that position. But we were just carrying this kind of perpetual 3 or 4 vacancies in many of our departments, and so. Looking at kind of the census of our groups, we knew that we had a lot of people who were eligible for service retirement. They were still otherwise healthy and engaged and performing. And so I think that we had a real, given these ongoing vacancies, we had a real concern that they might resign, take advantage of their pension and go next door to go back to the road as a patrol officer or a line firefighter. And so we really were concerned with losing people who still had kind of some gas left in the tank. And so we did incorporate this into many of our agreements, this ability for them to retire, begin collecting their pension. We would pay for those in Maine State Retirement. There's a unfunded actuarial liability payment. We would fund that and a few other kind of small provisions. So that was the motivation for us. Since we've signed these contracts and we've increased our wage scales and brought many of these other programs online, we actually have filled all of our vacancies. So it's already not a pressing concern, which is a great thing. But that was the motivation for a rehire provision.
Okay, great, thanks. And any of those other topics you want to jump on, Paul or Carl?
Rehire. Ooh, it's a good one. So I'm going to tell you right now that I think that what the municipality is trying to do when they go after rehire or offer it and put it in a CBA is great. And I can't wait to be in that position to possibly make more money and do whatever. What I want to advise everybody about is a lot of things we put on paper and we try to say that it's going to be great. And what everybody forgets is the people on the floor. And I can tell you right now that I have heard way too many grumblings about rehire on the floor, because I can tell you there's a lot of people that say, oh my God, I can't wait for this guy to be out of here. He's only here for 1 more year. He's lazy. He doesn't do his job, blah, 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 blah. Well, now guess what? Now he's got an extra 5 years. And that's 5 more years that I can't be promoted. And that's 5 more years that I have to wait. And that's 5 more years that I have to sit here and listen to this guy who's making double. So while I agree, and everybody does agree that it is a pretty good thing I think it's aces in the places. And I think trying to talk with labor management and trying to talk with the local about how to make it work would be way easier, because there should be, the ability for labor management or somebody to turn and say, hey, listen, this isn't working out, and actually have, something happen about it. Because, if you don't want to be doing a detriment by offering a benefit, and unfortunately, sometimes you are. And you know what? To the municipality's credit, they have no idea. They just think they're doing the right thing. But yet on the floor, it doesn't work out well. So, retire or hire is mixed. I'm there's times I'm for it and there's times I'm against it.
Can I just jump in?
Please.
Yeah.
I guess putting on my HR hat, it sounds like the issue isn't the retire rehire, it's the fact that someone's not being properly managed or maybe dealt with in that scenario. I think the other thing that there was some design behind it was, I think that setting people up for a successful financial retirement, if you allow someone to begin collecting their pension and theoretically they're living within the means of their existing salary, they can, bank that in some way, shape, or form for a period of time. I think the other motivation was really something involved with succession planning. If we know someone is going to stay on for another 3 years or 5 years, we have a pretty good timeline to work from beyond a 2-week notice to plan for those future changes. And so I absolutely, from Carl's perspective, I absolutely hear those really the hesitations around promotion. If you have someone who is in an officer or leadership role and they're permitted to stay on for another 3 or 5 years or whatever the case may be, and we did hear those concerns. I think for some of those people, whether they could retire or rehire or not, there are some who would stay on for the next 5 years anyway. But this certainly is more lucrative for them. And there is actually a annual budget savings. We're paying a 5% UAL fee as opposed to a 10.3 or 11.6 or whatever the pension contribution rate is. So that also helps from a financial standpoint. So those are kind of all I agree. There's no perfect solution. And Carl, as much as I'd love to say, you deal with the issue who's not performing and kind of retired on duty, and that's the issue. It's not the retire rehire. I'm not naive enough to know that that happens probably everywhere with some regularity. So those are just my comments.
Yeah. The only thing I would add is that it leads into the importance of a continued labor management effort. We have in our organization close to 42 different contracts, Scarborough being one and held out as one of the promising practices throughout the state. But I think we're doing more and more language to insert labor management as a concept, but also defining what that is, meaning there's no power dynamic here. This is a partnership, and being as specific as, well, who can call a meeting? Well, anyone can call a meeting as long as you can put that together. But it is very much locally centered, meaning the labor management in Scarborough is not going to be the same as the labor management in Holton because they're just two different animals with two different budgets and two different political systems. So it really is very much a tailor-made kind of thing and hearing from both sides. So to create labor management, you have to engage in labor management conversations. And I think with the retire rehire, that's the perfect example because I think just because it may be in the contract doesn't mean the labor management dynamic can't address those as they go along. And it is very much, okay, we wanted to get like many of our statutes, we want to get it on the books, and then it's going to go through a series of amendments as we begin to see the flaws or the ugly edges of it and things like that. But overall, I think our success with the retire rehire has been one, a cost savings, which in many cases has come back in the form of wages or inducements elsewhere in the contract, but also securing a huge need for properly trained people to come back. And I think in the law enforcement sector, we're doing that at a much lower extent, meaning I think 2 or 3 years is the general kind of retire, rehire schedule. It would be very rare for us to have anything over 4 or 5. So, but they generally last around 2 or 3 because of the recognition of the work that this is. But that's 2 or 3 years, as Liam has said, we can plan a succession and get people interested in coming on board. So I wanted to hit on the labor management, but I also want to cede all our time to Angela as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks. And I think that's a great segue, Paul, for us to transition. Angela, thank you for being here specifically to talk about the topic we're turning to next, which is what is going on, looking ahead. What are you dealing with? Recognition that a lot of landscapes have shifted dramatically in the last several months. And so you're going to lead us off, I think, in some discussion about what you are seeing out in the field in negotiating CBAs around, let's say, chaos.
Yeah, and I would say there are probably lots of folks on this meeting who have a variety of things that have started to pop up over the last since January. I think a couple of things that I specifically wanted to talk a little bit about were some of the impacts of either shutdowns or cuts or layoffs at the federal level, and that they're impacting both public and private sector employers, and sometimes in surprising ways and sometimes in ways that you would anticipate such a cut and expect it. I think one of the ones that happened sort of fastest in January was the sort of start of the shutdown of the services of the Federal Mediation and Conciliation, and FMCS has been a fairly integral part in a lot of collective bargaining agreements, especially in the private sector. Many mediation clauses specifically agree to FMCS as being the mediation service agreed upon in grievance mediation, but also there was sort of an immediate impact as people across FMCS were, told that they had to choose between returning to the office and so forth, that there was sort of an immediate reshuffling of assignments and people who were in the middle of mediating contracts and kind of having to pivot. And I think the underlying challenges of some of those loss of resources are, there were in some cases, immediate effect of sitting at a table, having to figure out how do we proceed now that our mediator isn't coming anymore? Some of that immediate impact of, both parties having to think about, well, what's our next step? And then looking at the contract language itself and saying, which contracts already have a provision to use some other sort of mediation service, and which contracts do we have to maybe quickly reassess that we need to have new language if we want mediation to continue to be viable, and have a named, plan for that in our contract. Because I think many of those provisions had been kind of rote, right? We hadn't thought about that this wasn't going to exist, and what do we do instead? And so there's, I think, a bit of a scramble to look at and reassess, what does our contract language actually say? Is it FMCS only named in here, and so forth? And so I think that started to be one of the first ripples that I got a sense that, ourselves as a union and employers, but also obviously the shift in immigration policy and the shift in immigration enforcement and so forth has had, I think, a pretty clear ripple to a lot of both, again, public sector and private sector. First and foremost, I think there was a real desire for many employers, as well as, us as unions, to scramble to figure out, what does this mean? What are the rights of the employer? What are the rights of the employees? What are we supposed to be, doing and not doing to not, violate the law in any, process that might be carried out? And then as, various pieces of enforcement, I think, have rippled out, or decisions around immigration have rippled out. There have been other effects. So we've had more than one employer where, kind of as a surprise, someone who had perfectly legal status and had been employment for many years with the employer, their status was taken away for no clear, like the employer did not have a sense of why, did not anticipate it. In one case, what we learned is that there had been people who were sort of in process, who were requesting permanent residency, and if that permanent residency hadn't been secured prior to the new administration stepping in, there was a blanket denial, that wasn't based on individual review. And so there were just people kind of randomly affected by that. And for some of those folks, they were also then, their current status of working was revoked. And so we saw people in positions where in some cases they were doing work that wasn't duplicated. It was work that they had been recruited for and were professionals at, and left a hole in the organization with very little notice. And I think that one of the realities for both union and employer in this has been that neither of us, as Paul was mentioning earlier, neither of us are in control of this dynamic fully, right? It's not the employer deciding to do these things. It's not the union deciding. It's both of us having to figure out now, what do we do with this situation, and what are the right steps to take? Do we have individual MOUs to give some space for people to handle getting reapproved for their status, which is, some of the strategy that I'm seeing both, us as a union and some employers are, going to that strategy and approaching us with, agreements around individual MOUs. But I'm also seeing us think about and, start to bargain contract language that is doing more to address immigration and immigration status questions than maybe had been bargained before, because it hadn't necessarily always in all, a lot of employers risen to the center of the discussion. There are some of our nonprofit employers who we had already had some contract language before, but there's, I think, a reassessment. Is this the right language in this situation as well? Does it provide notification so people can get support from the union if there is a investigation or a revocation of their work rights? Is there, what are we all prepared for, and how do we conduct ourselves legally if there is a re-verification or an investigation and a raid at a location? Are all things that I think we didn't spend a lot of time negotiating and thinking about, and are things that I'm hearing employers try to wrestle with and get, scramble to get legal advice from employment side attorneys and so forth. And likewise, unions being able to reach out and get advice about how do we navigate these waters? How do we make sure that we don't break the law, but also try to minimize the impact that this is having on our ability to maintain work, and to, for unions represent these workers through these situations.
Okay, great. And just backing up on the first topic you addressed, which is the sort of disappearance in some cases of FMCS, or do you have a sense of what resolutions people are finding to that? Too early to tell?
I think the initial scramble, and I don't know this is a permanent decision, was to just make sure our contract language already provided for, or some other mutually agreed mediation option, has been sort of the very quick fix. I know in the middle of negotiating some contracts where we had already agreed to that article, we quickly went back and revisited to make sure that it had that language, for example. I think one of the challenges, however, is that FMCS has been free, and so that made mediation such an attractive option and such an easy step for people to potentially avoid a very costly arbitration. And for private sector, there's not another especially for small organizations, I think it's a real struggle for the smallest employers that we represent to figure out like what would an alternative be that doesn't just seem like it costs basically the same as arbitration. And so how is mediation preserved in its concept and in as an alternative instead of sort of just becoming mediation light? And I don't know that we have a solution to that. It's more of a like, what is this going to look like over time now that this thing that's been such a cornerstone to how we think about having a step before arbitration that both parties can potentially find resolution and not necessarily be hugely costly. And so a real inducement to try to use that tool. I think it's hard to know whether that will start to impact whether people feel like we bother with mediating or not. I haven't got a sense yet. It's really fast.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to make a brief announcement. I'm going to interject that Annalee, if anyone is an attorney and would like credit for being here today, you can message Annalee with your bar number. She says she does have the regulars down. So if you're a regular, you probably don't need to bother with a message. But if you're not one of our regular participants, email Annalee your bar number. And so Angela, some of the other topics and other panelists, feel free to jump in too. I know we would sort of planned on Angela leading this discussion, but others feel free to jump in. We had talked about issues of job security, layoff language, remote work, harassment as also things that were coming to the forefront in negotiations in the new landscape.
I think this overlaps a little bit with what I was saying about the cuts at a federal level and the sort of general economic instability that people have been feeling over the last 3 months, that it feels like the conversation around potential layoffs or potential economic hits to both private and public sector employers is more real than it had been over maybe the last few years. And so re-looking at that language where we may have had the same language for quite a long period of time. Sorry, my phone is now dialing my computer for me. So I just want to talk to each other. So I think that, that is being looked at more carefully, certainly in public sector where there are potential ripple effects, right? There's places where there's direct federal funding for portions of, departments or services and so forth. In a lot of the private sector folks we represent, there's also a lot of direct grant funding and so forth that is, in flux or feeling less reliable or, sometimes being cut and then restored. Likewise, I think there's, while the actual layoffs have been around federal workers, what we've started to see and hear are, increasing concerns about either services that folks at the local or state level need in order to complete their own jobs, like databases that just aren't being run right now for a period of time, or specific positions here that can't do their job without the interplay of the federal level positions or the funding from the federal level to fund the projects that people are working on. And so while they may be state or local positions, there's a concern about the ripple of both the federal funding cuts, but also if you lay off too many federal workers, there's a fair amount of overlap of services that federal workers are connected to the state versions of those kinds of services, and missing resources or programs or databases or so all of those pieces that would normally be an interconnection between the two become a little bit more of a concern.
Okay. And then remote work. I think we had talked about that in our planning session, and I don't know if that's still a topic you want to touch on. That's what's
Um,
happening.
So sure, I feel like I've now talked a lot, and I'm like, isn't everyone sick of me already?
No, we're planning for you to talk a lot. Keep talking.
Keep going. All right. Um, so you know, I would say that coming out of COVID, this is one of the things that I think intersects a bit with the earlier section, as well as where we headed in the future. Coming out of COVID, I think there were a lot of jobs that were done remotely for an extended period of time, and that there was a real desire, sometimes from employers, but often from workers, to not go back, to really maintain that as a benefit of being able to perform work at home, meant for better work-life balance for many people. Not all, but many people felt like this was something we want to maintain. And I think that's been a driver in bringing that issue to the table, in a lot of contracts, and a kind of an ongoing back and forth of what's the balance between the needs to have people in person in order to fully perform the work and tasks, and you know what's needed in that respect, to, you know, what are the desires that workers have to, or in some cases that they feel that they perform them better from home, um, as well as this, I think, pull tug about the actual, as folks were saying earlier, there are people who have a very traditional sense of what it is to be working, and how that interplays with the conversation of whether it's legitimate to work from home, I think is still this strange area where there are people who just feel uncomfortable with the concept that people could work from home and not have to report to work, and that something about that is suspect. And culturally, I think that that hasn't all been worked through. And it certainly sometimes manifests from employer side of the table, but it also sometimes manifests from workers who are doubtful about other workers' ability to work from home. And so it feels like that's sort of a landscape that has been evolving, and there's been contract language about it, showing up in more and more contracts. It's been a topic that I think more and more I'm seeing workers both in the public and the private sector want to try to figure out how to do that as much as possible. There are some jobs where it's just not possible. You know, you cannot fix the road from home. There's no work from home DOT provision, for example. But there, I think, are more and more desires to have creative conversations about how can at least part of my job be done from home. So if it's not fully work remote, what does it mean to be able to do that in part? And how does that help me balance feeling like my work and my home life are both able to harmonize with each other, I think is the common conversation. What I think will be interesting is that, you know, this push on the federal level to force everybody away from working from home, you know, is, you know, this drive in that conversation at the federal level. It hasn't been clear whether that has a ripple effect locally or not, but it definitely, you know, was one of the heavy pushes. As I mentioned, you know, FMCS staff were some of the first wave in January to be told, either you report back to the office by this date or you might as well resign. I think obviously a national landscape that has that sort of aggressive return to the office agenda is one that it'll be interesting both as a union to navigate, but also I can see, and I already do hear from some of the employers, particularly in the public sector, where it's, you know, smaller or municipal, that they may have municipal boards or, you know, councils that share some of the hostility to work from home. And so how do we acknowledge at the table that it's actually quite a successful policy where people participating really like it, and also navigate that if we are too heavy duty in putting that in our contract language that it might make it harder, not easier, to get that contract language approved by a select board or a council and so forth. So like, again, it's this dynamic of sort of a larger context that is sometimes out of step with the lived reality that we're trying to bargain around in some of these discussions. And how do we navigate that starting to be a factor in the bargaining going forward, I guess.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. So, other panelists, any thoughts you want to offer on these topics that Angela just led us through? And then after that, I'm going to also ask if the audience folks want to offer comments or questions.
I think for me, I just had a quick question for Angela is, have you seen the ripple effect as far as your daily resources to the federal side? Like, is there now communication falling off between your counterparts at the federal level who provide resources and information down to you? Are they becoming more and more scarce, or have you seen any drop off in communication from them?
I think it depends. I mean, if we're talking services like FMCS, there's definitely been a drop off because there's just less people. I mean, there's no way for them to function on the level that they were functioning with the cuts that they've already received. I think, you know, we've had folks who, as I mentioned, have had, you know, for a period of time lost database connection for the services that they have to you know, do here in the state of Maine. And so they had like a week where, you know, that funding had been cut off and then it was restored. But during that week, they were sort of in crisis about how to implement the programs that they were implementing. So I think, you know, some of that volatility has caused challenges. And as federal layoffs roll out, it gets harder and harder for answers around things like, are the grants we're supposed to be getting going to be paid? Who will process that payment? How does that, you know, will this funding be available next year, next week, next month? Are becoming more questions. And then I think, you know, there's this flip side of that, which we've heard from, you know, private sector, which is fear of what's coming next around monitoring. And I mean, the whole like announcement that there should be a DOJ employee in every single nonprofit that receives federal funding is some weird stuff if you're a nonprofit. Yeah. To think about like what does all of this mean, and how do we with the changing environment around things like immigration rules and so forth, how do we make sure that we're maintaining our ability to still be funded and, you know, continue to put forward the services that we've been providing, and also be prepared that that could go away at any time. I think that feeling of crisis has been challenging for folks throughout the last few months, particularly in the private nonprofit world.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, Liam, you want to add
Crazy.
Yeah, just I just from the local perspective, you know, and watching kind of all the federal decisions, you know, I think it's for us anyway at the local level, I think it's sort of focused what our mission is, and is to actually be, you know, sort of the opposite of that and be really stable and consistent and not reactionary and not and so I think that's really been the largest effect with some of the stuff. I appreciate Angela's question about whether some of these federal policies or actions will garner some support at the local level, and there will be sort of local decision makers or elected officials who will want to see similar actions taken to, you know, whether that's removing remote work or something like that. I think my impression that, you know, the motivation for a lot of those decisions wasn't so much because there, you know, was a you know, reaction to remote work as much as just making that whole, you know, just make it as difficult as possible and as uncomfortable as possible for, you know, the federal workforce or federal grant recipients. So yeah, I think that we've sort of watched, and obviously, you know, municipal government where some are more affected than others with some of these proposed changes or funding freezes. But our response here in Scarborough has really been, I think it's more important than ever that we prove to be a stable, reliable, consistent deliverer of essential services in the face of a lot of other uncertainty and chaos.
Yeah, thanks, Liam. Okay, anything else from panelists? Because I think we could open up for some audience questions if not. Anybody in the audience want to offer their own observations of sort of micro trends and then what's happening on the ground right now looking forward, or any questions for any of the panelists?
I know there's been some chat going on, which I'm sure everyone can see.
Yeah.
I think if you'll just, Rebekah, just indulge me. I think just one other thing I just want to make a plug for in terms of local collective bargaining trends is one other thing that we have seen is we're bringing on more employees without coming in with a lot of experience. And so in our public works side, we've one of the things that we enacted with our last contract was also just a more concrete, deliberate training program for those skills, because we just aren't hiring people with experience. So that's just one other note I'll make as a follow-up to our points.
Okay, great. And any other comments from the panelists on any of the topics we've discussed today? Cool.
I have one, Rebekah.
Just Ronnie, thanks for your comments
to,
in the chat about the retire rehire.
Yeah, that's a hot button item some days. But to Liam's point on the you know, the public works, I mean, we're seeing it on the fire side as well. We're bringing in, you know, people that might have a EMS license or might have some fire experience, but not both. So we're, you know, writing a lot of language around conditions of employment, you know, to make sure they get that training and get the certifications they need. And we're running into a lot of that nowadays, that people can't pass, you know, EMT classes or Firefighter 1, Firefighter 2 programs. So it is becoming a challenge, no doubt.
Yeah. And that circles back, one of the topics we had identified but didn't really talk a lot about was this workforce training and development, which Liam kicked off a little bit. But if our other panelists want to talk any more about workforce training and development, we didn't really fully cover that in the initial part of the session.
Yeah. I think on the law enforcement side, it's a little bit more unique because there are some things out of local control. For example, the Maine Criminal Justice Academy. So for better or for worse, or lucky for us and not great for them, they have to wrestle with the idea of, we want qualified people. Therefore, how do we make a transition for a police officer leaving the state of Texas and coming to Maine? Clearly, at the very minimum, they're going to need training as to state and local law. However, how much of their academy training transfers over? And I think that's a constant conversation that is continually happening. And because there are so many different types of trainings across the country, that you can't just say if you come with a certification, you can do 40 hours of statutory training and be good, because so they're so different. So to Ronnie's point, we're luckily not for us, but for the academy, they're constantly wrestling with workforce training.
Yeah, good point. Okay, great. So the last topic, we can just touch on this briefly or pass, it was family medical leave. And I know there's still things happening in the legislature, so I don't know if anybody wants to venture a comment on what's happening right now or what might come next. But we could close out with that topic maybe. Nobody.
I think Liam.
I think
Liam should start a trend in having the great metropolis of Scarborough pay the whole 1% for all of his members because of the unknown. FMLA is weird. in the fire service, and it's very odd. We have done so well over the past 15, 20 years to try to get ways to take care of firefighters and first responders, benefits, all sorts of things. And we might be giving them too much now. I don't know, maybe. I mean, because, I can say from my end, when this paid FMLA goes into effect, we're going to be able to triple dip. We're going to be able to take our sick leave. We're going to be able to take paid FMLA, and we're going to be able to take income protection, short-term disability, whatever you want to call it. And I'm a little nervous. I can't imagine what it's going to be like in the private sector. But I can tell you right now, from our angle, I'm just seeing a Pandora's box getting opened and having all sorts of issues. The other fact is that, the municipalities don't talk to the paid FMLA part. So that means that I can file on my own, and who knows how many hours I have. And is the municipality deciding to run unpaid concurrently with paid FMLA if they know? There's so many unknowns about this, and I can't every contract that I've been doing lately that we have to put this language in there. It's almost like I've had one or two that have actually taken the 1% and they're paying it, and not splitting it half and half. But I can tell you that I mean, what defense do I have when they say, "Hey, we're going to split this half and half"? Oh, okay. I mean, because it's going to happen if it's not already happening. And the best or worst part is nobody has any idea how it's going to work, or how we're going to take it, or if it's good or if it's bad, or does it, does this benefit or help my retirement? Is this going towards my best 3 years? Is this, do I have to file taxes on this, or is this counted as my payroll? I have no idea. So there's so many openings with this FMLA thing, and I can tell you that right now every municipality that I deal with runs FMLA concurrently. Which, as long as the powers that be can speak to the individual, and explain to them that it's not a bad thing and how things are working out, we've been able to live in harmony. But paid FMLA language, I have no idea. And I mean, I don't know how the cops are doing it. And, but as far as I know, and I can't even imagine how the feds are doing it with Angela. I don't, it's confusing.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the perfect example of how we got onto this topic of these micro trends, is because something completely out of our control, this Paid Family Medical Leave Act by the state, really kind of engendered both employers and employees to come together. Because it's like, if you want to wreck a good thing, give it to a politician. So here we are, and they're trying to base it on FMLA, which is an even bigger folly because it's federal. And so you really have to sit down at the table and have that difficult conversation about, okay, we're making a commitment to medical leave in all these other places, whether it be mental health, whether it be physical fitness, but then how do we interact with this, because it represents not necessarily a challenge, but it centers around money, and that's always been the thing that we've been the most contentious on, as to, okay, who benefits and should they benefit more than the employer, and et cetera, et cetera. So it is the perfect example of how we get to the micro trends. It's that specific.
Yeah. Angela, I saw you unmuted. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, I think there are the first, I think, form of, how this has come into negotiations. I've seen for over a year, people negotiating around the percentage and it's fallen in a number of different ways, right? Where we have some employers that are picking up the full 1%, some that are not.
Yep.
And some that it's been sort of a matter of compromise, that, okay, we're going to split this, but here's this other way that, it factors into the financial package. And so overall, I think the other part of the discussion that has been more present in the last 6 months is this exceptions conversation, of which employers might be attempting to get an exception and have their own program. There are some that are pursuing that, that are in the private sector that we're bargaining with. And that's an even, more interesting set of unknowns. They don't know what that's going to look like often exactly yet, or how much exactly it will cost. And so trying to figure out how we bargain some parameters around that has been a piece of it. And then I think in all of the discussions, there's a sense from both sides of the table of we don't know exactly how this is going to play out in its impact on the other sorts of leave and benefits that overlap with it. So we've increasingly had paid parental leave in contracts. Well, how does this speak to that, or does it? Is it separate? They overlap. Other sorts of, mental health leave, medical leave, and so forth. How are all these different leaves that we've in some ways, I think, bargained a cobbled together version of a comprehensive leave, right? Many contracts have a variety of different things that are attempting to get closer and closer to having paid some version of this kind of paid leave. But now that we've done that in so many agreements, I think it's going to be an ongoing assessment as it gets rolled out. How does this impact our understanding of what we should have bargained in other provisions that might overlap? And I feel like is a real unknown that we can all sit around and identify. It'll be interesting to figure out is sort of what we identify, but we don't know. And so there's a lot of, discussion of, well, when this gets implemented, if our contract is going to extend, 2 years beyond that or something, do we have some provision in it to even come back to this discussion on these specific overlapping provisions earlier than that? Because we'll start to see impacts that we may need to address that we couldn't anticipate at this moment. So
Right.
that's the other thing I think I'm seeing as far as, how are we trying to cope with it at the bargaining table?
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, any final points from our panelists? Okay, well, thank you so much, Liam, Paul, and Carl, and Angela, for your insightful comments about what we've been up to and where we're going. And I think we can close out now and give Carl 10 minutes to do some bird watching before he has whatever is next.
Go for the hummingbird, man.
Rebekah, just one.
I want to
September-
announce the annual conference.
There you go. Yeah.
Okay.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you for that reminder. September 19th, I have that right, I think, in Scarborough again. Liam is graciously helping us get space at Town Hall, and you'll be getting information about that through email, but mark your calendars for September 19th. That's our next program, I think, right? Because we're on like our summer break, essentially. Yeah, it's going to be a great program. So, okay. Well, thanks everybody for being here. Any other announcements, Liam, that I'm forgetting? Okay. Okay, great. Well, thanks again to our panelists, and thanks everyone who came and observed, and I hope you got some useful information.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks.